Well, Tehran says it will retaliate after the U.S. military attacked and seized an Iranian cargo ship yesterday. The president claimed on social media that the ship was attempting to get past the American blockade of Iran's ports and coastline. That action is threatening a second round of peace talks planned for today in Pakistan. The White House says Vice President J.D. Vance is leading the delegation after President Trump initially told reporters yesterday the vice president would not be traveling to the Middle East. But a spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry has said that Iran has no plans for another round of negotiations with the U.S. All of this has oil prices rising this morning, with markets in both the U.S. and internationally jumping 5%, sitting right now at around $88 and $96 a barrel. The Trump administration, meanwhile, has again lifted sanctions on Russian oil for 30 days. That is despite Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent ruling out that move, vowing to rule it out while speaking to reporters Wednesday at the White House.
We will not be renewing the general license on Russian oil, and we will not be renewing the general license on Iranian oil. Because again, that was oil that was on the water prior to March 11th. Right. So all that has been used.
So it's very clear. Donald Trump is doing everything he can do to help Vladimir Putin at a time when Vladimir Putin finds himself backed into a corner because of an ongoing war in Ukraine, a war that he thought was going to be over in 3 days, that continues to drag on year after year. The Trump administration has been lying for over a year, saying that Donbass is about to fall. They've continued to lie about Russia's ability. They've continued to lie about how strong Russia is. They've continued to lie about how strong Vladimir Putin is. They've continued to lie about how the Ukrainians have to back down and do everything they can and just hope for a peace deal with the Russians. They've continued to lie about the strength of the economy. The Russian economy is in tatters. They've continued to lie about Putin's stability in Russia. It is at an all-time low right now. And so what do? They give him another 30-day lifeline after lying to the American people about not giving him another 30-day lifeline? It just continues. This war could be over. Putin could have been forced to the negotiating table. I know a lot of people in the past said Putin's going to do what Putin's going to do. A deal could have been struck. But, you know, Donald Trump himself and people around him continue to despise the freedom fighters, continue to despise the Ukrainians, continue to despise Zelensky, continue to despise the very people that were invaded by Vladimir Putin's Russian invaders. And as I've said time and time again on this program, if they didn't hate the Ukrainian freedom fighters so much, they wouldn't have stumbled blindly into Iran, thinking that they were going to be able to just knock Iran over in 3 or 4 days or in 2 weeks. They would have looked at what the Ukrainians did, like the Secretary of Army, and said, my God, they've changed the very face of warfare. And in changing the very face of warfare, they have sent a real warning signal to us, which we will take heed of. And the president keeps making up wars that he ended when he won't end the one war he has the power and leverage to end. And that is the one between Vladimir Putin's Russian invaders and the Ukrainians. He just refuses to do it. And Admiral Kirby, I have no idea why he continues to let Vladimir Putin off the hook when the Russian leader is so weak right now.
You know, look, Putin wants 3 things. He wants Ukraine, obviously. He wants to divide the West, and he wants to rebuild from a wartime economy to a more stable economy. And many of the decisions that this administration has made in the last 15, 16 months have actually aided him in all 3 of those ways, including Bessent's, extension now of the waivers here and lifting of oil sanctions. But to your point, the war could have been ended, but it would have required things of Mr. Trump that I just don't think he's capable of exploring. And one of them is supporting Zelensky. I mean, there's a grudge here that goes way, way back to his first administration with President Zelensky and Ukraine in general. And so not supporting them militarily has definitely caused the stasis that we're seeing along the Donbass, the eastern and the southern part of Ukraine, and the fact that neither side has really made much progress. But the war drags on. And again, that benefits Vladimir Putin. That's exactly what he wants. And these the castigating of allies, the lack of pulling together some kind of international coalition to help in Iran, all of that also satisfies Putin's desires to further divide the West and to divide NATO. I go back to my trip to Europe this past week, speaking to NATO officers, military officers. I mean, they're moving on. They're moving on without the United States, Joe. They see a future in the alliance that either has a very minimal American leadership or presence, or maybe even none. And they are adjusting their realities to that. And that is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants.
Well, and Caddy, the Europeans saw you had the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State of the United States, all going to Hungary, all trying desperately to help a man get reelected as prime minister in that country. A man who told Vladimir Putin, basically, I will be your foreign agent here. The same thing with Lavrov having conversations with his foreign minister, with Hungary's foreign minister. They were nothing but Putin's dupes. They were doing everything they could do to help Vladimir Putin from Hungary, to stop every bill that could have gone through, every funding mechanism that could have gone through the EU to help the Ukrainians out. It was constantly Orban standing in the way, and you actually had Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin both desperately trying to help this man who was desperately trying to help the Russian invaders.
Yeah, you had the irony during the election in Hungary that you had J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, and officers of the GRU, the Russian security services, both in Budapest at the same time with the same aim, trying to get Viktor Orban elected. And they didn't. And maybe we'll look back, Joe, and think 2026 was the year of peak populism. And you've got the midterm elections in America here coming up that will deal a blow to populism. You've had the defeat of Viktor Orban, despite the White House weighing in, that is also a blow to populism. But Admiral Kirby's quite right. The net outcome of this escapade that Donald Trump undertook, this war of choice that he undertook in Iran, the biggest outcome of it is that it's benefited Russia and it's benefited China. And Mark, one of the things that is so interesting as we head into this incredibly confusing week, which we really don't know about the Strait, we don't know about the negotiations, but I keep thinking and listening back about those negotiations. The White House has been telling reporters that they're very optimistic, and they were very optimistic last time around, that Vance and the Iranians who were sent were very close. They almost had some kind of a deal. And part of me wonders whether that was just misinformation being spread by the administration, because we know how long it took last time. It took 20 months of direct negotiations to get the JCPOA. Were they really that close? And even if they were close last time around, what are the chances for negotiations this week as we head into Pakistan?
So Caddy, I bought in on Friday to the same kind of optimism that I think so many others did as well. I mean, there was kind of repeated efforts by U.S. officials on background to basically the entire Washington press corps that things were rather optimistic, and then they all fell apart. So you do have to ask yourself, why? Was this just spin? Were they trying to do, and I hate to bring this up, but market manipulation? Obviously Donald Trump cares about the price of gas being low, oil prices going down. The stock market going up, all those things happened. It could be that. There also is the notion that, of course, there was dissension even within the Iranian ranks. Perhaps they were hearing this from certain Iranians they were talking to, but as we've seen over the last 24 hours, the IRGC, the hardline elements, seem to be in control. Those with guns make the decisions, and Vahidi, the IRGC chief, seems to be the one calling the shots now. So it could be a combination of all of those. But at the end of the day, I think we have to be cautious when we do hear this kind of spin from the White House, even if these are sources that the press have, because the enemy, the Iranians, get a vote. And I think it turns out at the end of the day that might not have been accurately what's happening. One quick point with what Joe said about David Ignatius. I always have to bring this up. He wrote a book about his time in Beirut in 1983, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy barracks. It's called Agents of Innocence. It's about the CIA, the role there that the CIA had in recruiting agents. I gave that book to every young case officer who ever worked for me when I was the deputy ops chief of the Near East Division. And so David, even I'm a little bit younger, but his impact is pretty profound.
All right, MS Now National Security and Intelligence Analyst, retired CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos, and MS Now National Security Analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby. Thank you both very much for coming on this morning.